At my own son's backyard barbecue, a party I set up, myself paid for myself. I accidentally bumped into my son while carrying a tray of drinks. He spun around and struck me across the face in front of 30 people. Then his wife crossed the yard and said quietly, "You startled him. Apologize or leave our home." So I left. I walked out through a gate I built. With my own hands, got in my truck and made one phone call. By the time they drove home that evening, 3 strangers were already waiting at their front door. I have spent my whole life building things with these hands. Concrete slabs, timber frames, rooftops, engineered to survive 40 years of California rain. 31 years I ran a small contracting outfit out of Glendale. And one thing I understood early, the most critical element of any structure was never the piece you could admire from the street. It was always what lay hidden beneath it, the part no one thought to inspect until the day something gave way and the whole thing began to split open. That truth took me a long time to apply to my own family. But once the cracks appeared, I couldn't pretend they weren't there. And I had spent too many decades learning how to fix what was broken at the foundation to just walk away and let it crumble. Welcome back to His Hidden Revenge. Before we get into today's story, drop a word in the comments, just one word that describes how you're feeling right now. It can be anything: tired, grateful, hopeful, still figuring it out. Whatever is honest. I read every single one. Now, a brief note: some details in this story have been shaped for storytelling purposes, and any resemblance to specific real people or places is purely coincidental. What matters is the truth at the center of it. That afternoon plays back in my head like something I can still feel in my chest. A Saturday in September, the kind of Glendale day where the sky turns a shade of blue so sharp it nearly stings to look at. Garrett and Renee had the backyard arranged with folding tables, paper plates, paper lanterns strung along the fence, and a charcoal grill going full heat near the far wall. Relations I hadn't crossed paths with since Christmas milled around holding plastic cups. The grandnephews were tearing through the grass after each other. Someone had the music on, nothing loud, just something soft and unhurried, riding just above everyone's heads, easy enough to talk through. I'd gotten there before the first guest. 3 days prior, Renee had sent a text. "Dad, we're a little short this month. Could you grab some decorations and maybe the drinks?" I didn't fire back immediately. I stood at my kitchen counter, phone in hand, and went through it twice. Next morning, I drove out to the party supply place on Brand Boulevard. Streamers went into the cart. Then the plastic tablecloths in blue and white. 4 cases of iced tea and 2 bags of ice. I stacked it all in the truck bed and made the run over to Kensington Drive. 22 years I had called that address home. Garrett and Renee had been the ones living there for the past 3. I'd just placed the last tray of cups beside the grill when Howie DeLuca appeared at the fence next door, arm raised in a wave. "You need a hand with anything, Len," he called across. Howie was 71, a retired man who had planted himself beside that property longer than I had. He had enough history with me to know when a hand was welcome and when silence was the better offer. "I think I got it, Howie," I said, "but thank you." His nod came slow and deliberate, the kind a man gives when the gesture carries more weight than the words. Then he turned back to his garden, the invitation turned up by chance, face up on the table's edge near the cooler, printed on cream cardstock. Renee had put it together herself. The font gave her away, same one she used on everything. The header read in clean black lettering, "A Hargrove Family Gathering, hosted by Garrett and Renee Hargrove." I lifted it, read it through once, flipped it to check the back. Nothing there. My name was nowhere on it. I held that card in the yard of the house where I had spent the better part of my life, the noise of my family gathering all around me. I creased it once down the middle and slid it into my breast pocket. Then I went back to the cups. By 2 every corner of the yard was occupied. Garrett had the grill, and he was carrying on the way he always did, in a crowd voice above everyone else's laughter, easy and loud. 38 years old, and he'd inherited his mother's eyes and my jaw, and past that. I couldn't find much left that I recognized as my own. Renee worked the crowd with a pitcher of lemonade, a smile fixed on her face, her hand finding someone's arm, leaning in close. The same careful routine I had watched her run at every family occasion for 6 years straight. I was bringing a second tray out of the kitchen when it happened. The screen door swung shut at my back. The tray was loaded wide with cups. I cleared the porch corner, and there was Garrett, closer than I was ready for, angled away mid-conversation with someone behind him. I cut to one side to give him room, but the tray's edge caught his arm. He came around fast. His face registered before I felt anything else. Jaw set, hard, eyes gone dim and flat. The look of a man who has spent the whole day swallowing something bitter and finally found a place to spit it out. Owen told me later that Garrett had taken a call that morning. A business partner had walked away from a deal Garrett had been banking on for months. $300,000 gone before noon. None of that had reached me yet. What I knew was the tray went sideways, 2 cups hit the ground, and his right hand swung and caught me across the face. The crack of it was sharp and hollow together, like timber splitting under a heel. The cups clattered across the patio stones. The lemonade ran across the concrete and worked its way into my shoes, and the yard just stopped. Not the pause that follows a song ending. The kind of stillness that falls when 30 people simultaneously stop breathing and hold themselves there. The grill hissed behind me. Somewhere at my back, a child took 2 quick steps and went still. I put 2 fingers to my cheek. The heat ran in a narrow line from the bone down toward my jaw. I looked at Garrett. His chest was working in short pulls. That hand of his was still half raised, as if the instruction to lower it hadn't arrived yet. The expression on his face was one I had no memory of seeing before, part rage, part something dawning and dark. The first flash of a man realizing he'd just crossed a line he couldn't step back over. "Watch where you're going," he said, his voice already dropping, the fury pulling inward like it had taken what it came for. I said nothing back. Instead, I swept my gaze across the yard. Cousins with their cups suspended midair, a nephew near the fence with his chin fixed toward the ground. Aunt Beverly, 63 years old, a woman who had known me since long before. Garrett drew his first breath, motionless with her arms folded and her mouth held shut. And at the far end of the porch, my younger son, Owen, 29 years old, standing without moving, phone raised and pointed toward us. Not one person shifted. Renee set the pitcher on the nearest surface. She came across the yard, sandals ticking against the patio stones, and drew up alongside her husband. Her hand settled on Garrett's arm. She turned her eyes to me. Right then I understood that the next move was mine alone to make. Renee had a particular gift for delivering difficult things in a voice that made them sound like common sense. Measured, unhurried, the tone of someone performing composure while quietly arranging things so that everyone present understands who the problem is. I'd sat across from it at Thanksgiving tables. I'd heard it the time she called to explain why they hadn't been able to make it to Elaine's hospital appointments. Before she said a word, I already knew the shape of what was coming. Dad gently, almost with warmth, as though she were offering me something. "I think you owe Garrett an apology." The yard held its silence. 30 people, none of them breathing loud enough to hear. Behind me, the charcoal grill ran its low mechanical cycle, and beyond the fence, a neighbor's sprinklers had switched on. The unremarkable sounds of a Saturday in Glendale, indifferent to everything that had just occurred. I pressed my fingers to the bone beneath my eye. The flesh felt thick and hot already, something tight swelling from underneath. I dropped my hand and met her gaze. "He hit me," I said. "You bumped into him," she answered. Her voice didn't shift a degree. "You startled him. You know the way stress affects him." I cut my eyes to Garrett. He'd stepped partly behind Renee's arms, folded across his chest, jaw angled up. Something in how he was holding himself pulled at a memory, and it took me a second to land on it. It was how a man stands when he's aware he did wrong and has resolved not to be the one who acknowledges it. He was counting on the room to carry him. His whole adult life he had leaned on rooms to carry him. "Apologize," Renee said, her voice even, "or I'm going to have to ask you to leave." I took in the yard around me. Aunt Beverly near the far table, 63 years old, Elaine's younger sister, a fixture at every gathering in my memory, stretching back 4 decades. Her eyes were on me, and they held something halfway between sorrow and shame. Her lips parted the smallest amount. Then she dropped her gaze to the grass. My nephew Clint had become very absorbed in the printing on his cup. 2 of the younger cousins had quietly migrated toward the back fence, widening the gap between themselves and the trouble without quite removing themselves from the scene. A woman I barely knew some connection of Renee's from her office had her face buried in her phone with exaggerated purpose. Owen was still positioned at the corner of the porch. He'd brought the phone down, but his grip on it hadn't loosened knuckles white against the case. Our eyes met for a single second. What his face held in that moment was 29 years of knowing his father, compressed into one look. He gave me the smallest nod I have ever received from another person. My mind went back to a morning, almost a year before that. I had pulled into the driveway on Kensington Drive to drop off a casserole Elaine had made for Garrett and Renee during a stretch they said had been especially hard. I'd parked in the spot closest to the side gate, the one I had always used, the one that had been my spot for the 22 years I'd lived there. Garrett came out carrying a trash bag and stopped cold when he spotted my truck. "That's my spot," he said, loud enough for the neighbors to catch it, loud enough for Howie DeLuca, trimming his hedge 10 FT away, to pause the shears. "I've told you before, Dad. Basic courtesy." I had moved the truck. I carried the casserole to the door. I drove home telling myself the argument wasn't worth having. Standing there now with the burn still fresh on my face, I grasped something I should have understood that morning. Yielding to a man like Garrett didn't earn peace. It handed him confidence. Every time I gave an inch, he pressed forward too. And somewhere over the years, the people around us had begun to measure the distance between us and concluded I was the one who had retreated. I was 68 years old. I had laid concrete in 100-degree heat. I had buried my wife. I had written checks to cover debts my son was too proud to acknowledge. I had driven my mother to chemotherapy 11 times in the last year of her life, while Garrett mailed flowers and apologies from cities he may or may not have actually been in. I was through giving ground. "No," I said. It came out softer than I planned, but it landed exactly the way I meant it. Clean and level and final, like a carpenter's bubble settling at zero. Renee's eyes went hard. "Then I need you to go, Dad. I'm sorry." She didn't sound sorry. I bent and picked up 2 of the fallen cups from the patio stones. I set them on the table beside me. I took one slow look around the yard at the decorations I had paid for, at the tablecloths I had laid out, at the lemonade running thin between the cracks in the concrete. Then I walked to the side gate, the same one I had built and hung myself in the summer of 2002, and I pushed through it. Behind me, Garrett said something to Renee under his breath. She gave a short, quiet laugh. I didn't turn around. The gate swung closed behind me with a sound like a period dropped at the end of a very long sentence. I walked to my truck. My hands were shaking faintly, not from fear but from the particular tension that accumulates in a man who has kept himself completely still for too long. I settled into the driver's seat and stared out at the empty street. My phone pressed against my thigh and buzzed. I drew it out and checked the screen. 1 missed call. Franklin Eckhart, attorney at law. I didn't return it. I laid the phone face down on the passenger seat and eased away from the curb. Franklin Eckhart had been Elaine's attorney for 11 years. He was a deliberate man who did not pick up the phone without cause, and whatever his reason for calling was, I wasn't ready to face it yet. I needed 10 minutes first, maybe 20. I drove north on Kensington Drive without a destination in mind. The late afternoon sun hung low and oblique, driving straight through the windshield and making me squint. I reached up and dropped the visor. The same bungalows and jacaranda trees I had driven past 1,000 times scrolled by the windows, and something in my chest that I had been clenching without knowing it began to loosen. Elaine used to say that a long drive was cheaper than a therapist, and worked about as well. The thought of her closed my throat around her name. She had been gone 8 months, pancreatic cancer diagnosed in October, gone by January, 4 months from the first scan to the burial, and I had been present for every one of those days. I had learned to read the monitors beside her hospital bed. I had memorized which nurses worked, which rotations, and which would take time to answer questions and which wouldn't. I drove her to 31 medical appointments across the span of her illness. I know the exact number because I kept a notebook in the glove compartment of this same truck recording dates, dosages, and the names of medications I had never encountered before and hoped never to encounter again. Garrett had come 4 times. He sent flowers twice, phoned on her birthday, and showed up to the funeral in a dark suit that still had the dry cleaning tag tucked inside the collar. I saw it during the service and said nothing. Elaine would have spotted it too, and found it funny later quietly, just the 2 of us. That was our way. We noticed things together. I stopped at a red light on Central Avenue and checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. The mark on my cheek had deepened. It was no longer just heat and swelling. It was the start of a bruise, the kind that would go purple overnight and need 2 weeks to work itself out. I was 68 years old, and my son had left a bruise on my face in front of 30 people, and not one of them had said a word to him directly about it. Not one. The light shifted. I drove. I found myself returning to a conversation I'd had with Elaine about 2 months before she passed. It was a Tuesday evening, and she was having one of her better days propped up in bed, with the reading lamp burning sharper than she had been in weeks. I had brought her soup from the Thai place on Maryland Avenue that she was fond of, even though by that point she could manage only a few spoonfuls. She watched me settle the container on her tray, and then said, without any let up at all, "Garrett took $4,000 from my savings account in August." I put down the spoon. "I know," she said before I could speak. "I've known for a while. I didn't want to upset you." She studied her hands lying on the blanket. "He told me it was a short-term loan. He said he'd put it back before I noticed." She was quiet a moment. "He didn't put it back." "Elaine," I started. "I'm not telling you because I want you to confront him," she said. Her voice carried the weight of exhaustion, but her eyes stayed steady. They had always been steady even near the end. "I'm telling you because I need you to understand something about why I've been making certain arrangements." I asked her what arrangement she meant. She reached across to the nightstand and took my hand in both of hers. Her fingers were thinner than they had any right to be. "I've been talking to Franklin," she said. "There are things I want to make sure are handled correctly. Before, I can't handle them anymore." I turned off Central Avenue onto a quieter side street and let the truck slow. Outside, a man was walking a golden retriever along the pavement. A woman crouched in her front garden pulling weeds. The unremarkable machinery of a Saturday afternoon, people going about the quiet work of their lives. I thought about what Elaine had said next that evening in the hospital room. She looked at me for a long moment, then said, "I want you to promise me something, Len. I want you to promise me that when the time comes, you won't let guilt make your decisions for you. Not guilt over Garrett, not guilt over the family. Just ask yourself what I would have wanted you to do." I had promised her. I pulled into the driveway of my own small place on Cypress Street, the one I had moved into after Elaine and I decided Garrett and Renee needed more room. That had been 3 years ago. I had told myself it was a practical decision, a generous one. I had told myself a great many things over those 3 years. I sat in the driveway with the engine still running. Through the windshield, I could make out the potted marigolds on my front porch that Elaine had planted the spring before she got sick. I watered them every other day because she would have wanted me to. The phone buzzed again on the passenger seat. Franklin Eckhart, attorney at law. This time, I answered. "Mr. Hargrove." Franklin Eckhart's voice was exactly as I remembered it. Calm and deliberate, the voice of a man who had spent 30 years earning the right to speak slowly. "I've been trying to reach you." "I know," I said. I wasn't in a place to take the call. A short pause settled on the line, the comfortable kind. Franklin was not a man who stuffed silence with words just to fill it. "Are you ready now?" I fixed my gaze on the marigolds through the windshield. The low afternoon sun was working the petals, warming them toward orange. Elaine had picked that particular variety because she said they were hard to kill. She hadn't been wrong. "Go ahead and tell me," I said. Franklin had been Elaine's attorney since 2011. She'd come across him through someone at the school where she volunteered, and she walked in the door that first evening and announced he was the most thorough man she had ever sat across from. From Elaine, that carried real weight. Thoroughness was something she practiced herself. She didn't throw that word around. "Before anything else, I have a direct question," Franklin said. "Did something take place today at the family gathering?" My fingers went to the side of my face. The bruise had set itself in by now, a steady low throb moving from the cheekbone down toward the jawline. "Yes," I said. "Something did." "Give me a brief description." My son hit me across the face, in front of approximately 30 people, at a gathering held in the home on Kensington Drive. Another pause. When Franklin came back, the tone was the same, but something beneath it had tightened. "Mr. Hargrove, I want you to understand exactly what you've just told me means. Are you alone somewhere? I'm sitting in my truck. That works." I caught the faint sound of papers shifting. "As you know, when Mrs. Hargrove transferred the Kensington Drive property into your name 8 months ago, it went through a properly recorded grant deed filed with the Los Angeles County Recorder's Office. That deed made you the sole legal owner. Garrett and Renee Hargrove hold no ownership interest in that property, none at all." "I'm aware of that," I said. "What they possess," Franklin went on, "is what the law calls a license to occupy, not a lease, not a rental agreement. No rent changes hands. They hold no tenancy rights. The only reason they're living there is because you, the owner, gave them your permission. Under California law, that distinction is enormously significant." A mockingbird dropped onto my porch railing and cocked its head at the marigolds. "Keep going," I said. Mrs. Hargrove was precise when she put the occupancy terms together. She built in a protection clause. If either occupant directed harassment, intimidation, or any form of physical violence toward you, the license to occupy would end on the spot. No court hearing required, no delay. Immediate termination because they are licensees and not tenants, and California law handles those two categories very differently. She never gave me the exact language, I told him. She mentioned the clause existed, said she hoped the day would never come when I needed it. That sounds like her, Franklin said, and his voice dropped slightly on the words. It did. It was exactly her, always carrying the harder knowledge herself, protecting me from it until the moment I truly needed to know. There is something else, Franklin said. I want you to hear this part carefully. He paused a beat. You also signed the occupancy agreement, Mr. Hargrove. You were in the room when it was drawn up. Your signature went on alongside Mrs. Hargrove's because you wanted Garrett and Renee to have a real chance. You said yourself that you hoped the clause would sit unused, that you were giving your son the opportunity to show he was a different man. My grip pressed tighter around the phone. I remembered that afternoon in Franklin's office on Brand Boulevard. Elaine had been worn down that day more than she let on, but she sat upright and spoke without faltering. I had put my name under hers on the final page, and I had told myself it was the right call, that before a father shuts any door he owes his son, every chance that's left. There is one more item, Franklin continued. Approximately 40 minutes ago, I received a video file. It came from a number registered to an Owen Hargrove. Owen, my younger boy, posted at the far end of that porch with his phone trained on us. I sat with that for a second and then closed my eyes. Mr. Hargrove, Franklin's voice stayed level. The video documents a physical assault clearly and completely. This is no longer only a property matter. I'm pushing through an emergency protective order with the local court as we speak. Under California law, the violence itself immediately revokes their license to occupy. With the court order behind it, the Glendale police will meet my team at the property, serve the eviction notice, and see to it that they clear out tonight for your protection. We don't need months of litigation. The law is on your side, and so is the evidence. The Mockingbird lifted off the railing without a sound and disappeared. I thought about Elaine's hands closed around mine in that hospital room. I thought about the promise she'd pulled from me. I thought about the invitation card sitting in my breast pocket, the one that listed Garrett and Renee Hargrove as hosts in those neat black letters. Move forward, Franklin, I said. Do what Elaine asked you to do. A short silence. My team will be at the property within the hour, Mr. Hargrove. They'll get there before Garrett and Renee come back from the gathering. The line went dead. I stayed in the driveway without moving for a long while. The sun had slid behind the roof lines to the west. The marigolds on the porch had gone dim in the shade. Somewhere across town, at a house on Kensington Drive, with my name on the deed, something was about to close for good. I went inside without touching the lights. I lowered myself into the armchair beside the front window, the one Elaine had reupholstered in the dark green fabric the year before we left Kensington Drive, and I let the room darken around me. Out on the street, Glendale was doing what it does on a Saturday evening, winding down one small sound at a time. A car nosing into a driveway, somebody's voice carrying across a yard to call a dog inside, a lawnmower 2 houses down, taking its last pass before the light gave out. On the shelf across from me stood a photograph. Garrett, at maybe 7 years old, out in the backyard on Kensington Drive, in a soccer uniform and holding a trophy that dwarfed him. His grin was so wide his eyes had nearly disappeared into it. I was next to him with my hand resting on his shoulder, mid-laugh, at something he'd just come out with. Whatever it was, I couldn't pull it back anymore. I studied that photograph for a long time. Then my mind moved to the year I'd spent in that backyard with his boy. Caden arrived in March, and by June Renee was on the phone, asking whether I could come stay for a stretch. Just until we find our footing, she said. Garrett's new job keeps brutal hours, and I can't hold everything together on my own. I said I'd be there first thing Monday. I settled into the guest room on Kensington Drive and didn't leave for 11 months. I was up for Caden's 6 Oro bottle, while Garrett and Renee were still asleep. I figured out which formula sat right with him and which one tied his stomach in knots, and I picked up the right kind every week without anyone asking me to. I spent hours on the kitchen floor with him, on his playmat building towers of wooden blocks and watching them fall, then building them again 50 times, 100 times, because every collapse pulled the same enormous laugh out of him. That sound was worth everything. Tuesday and Thursday mornings, I took him to the park over on Glen Oaks Boulevard. I got to know every duck on that pond well enough to tell them apart. What I had no idea about, not until much later, was that Renee had put up 2 cameras, one in the living room, one in the play area during my second week staying there. Owen eventually told me, after hearing it from a cousin, Renee had let it slip to at some gathering years down the road. The cameras were angled at the spots where I spent the most time with Caden. Renee had been going through the footage on a regular basis. Owen told me she had once let it slip to this cousin, that she was hunting for something she could use if the need ever arose. I sat in my darkened living room and turned that fact over slowly, the way you examine the underside of a stone. She had watched me care for her son across 11 months, watched me change him, feed him, teach him to clap his hands and say, "more," when he wanted another cracker. She had sat with all of it, waiting to find something she could use against me, and she had come up empty because there was nothing there to find. I had loved that boy the way I had loved Garrett. At that same age, no conditions attached, no ledger being kept. My pocket buzzed. I pulled out the phone. "Owen. Dad?" His voice was wound tight. "Are you all right? Where are you?" "Home," I said. "I'm fine." "You're not fine." "Nobody is fine after what just happened to them." I heard him push out a long breath. "I need you to hear something. Right now, before anything else." From the moment Garrett turned around, I was recording. I caught every bit of it. "Dad, I already sent it to Mr. Eckhart." Something moved through my chest that I hadn't been ready for. Pride and grief arriving at the same time, tangled together. "Why were you filming?" Owen was quiet for a beat. "Because I've watched Garrett treat you that way for 3 years, and not one person has ever done a thing about it. I made up my mind a long time back that if it ever crossed a line, I wasn't going to be another person who just stood there and watched." His voice frayed at the edge. "I should have stepped in today instead of just recording. I've been carrying that since you went through that gate." "You did the right thing," I told him. "I should have said something myself." "Owen," I kept my voice steady. "What you did today may end up meaning more than anything anyone could have said out there. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" He didn't answer immediately. I could hear him breathing on the other end. My mind went back to an afternoon about 2 years after the stretch I spent looking after Caden. Garrett had called on a Wednesday evening, and I recognized the quality in his voice before he got 3 sentences in that careful lowered register he pulled out when he needed something, and was working himself up to the ask. "Dad, I've hit a tight spot," he said. "The utility company is about to shut off the power and gas on the same day. There's a billing error. I just need a few weeks to straighten it out." I knew it wasn't a billing error. I knew because Nadine Holloway, who had managed the books at my contracting company for 14 years before I sold it, had mentioned a few months earlier that she had spotted Garrett at a sports bar off the 110 freeway, that he'd been there a good while, and that the money on the table had nothing to do with food or drinks. The 2 overdue bills together came to $6,400. I phoned Nadine the next morning and asked her to wire the payment straight out of my personal savings account. "Len, are you certain about this?" she said. "That's your retirement money." I told her to go ahead. Garrett never had any idea how close he came to sitting in the dark. He also never knew who kept the lights burning. "Dad," Owen said over the phone, "are you still with me?" "I'm here," I said. "Come by tomorrow morning. I'll put coffee on." After we said goodnight, I sat a while longer in the dark. The photograph of Garrett in his soccer uniform caught what little light still came through the window. That boy holding the trophy, grinning at something I couldn't retrieve anymore. I found myself wondering exactly when the gap between that child and the man standing in that backyard this afternoon had grown too wide to bridge. Eventually, I got up and moved to the kitchen. I filled the stovetop espresso pot and put it on the burner the old-fashioned way, because she never trusted drip machines to hold the temperature right. The kitchen held the smell of coffee and dish soap, and beneath it the faint trace of the dried rosemary she used to keep in a small jar on the windowsill. I had replaced the jar twice since January because I couldn't bring myself to stop. I stood at the counter watching the pot and let my thoughts settle on the last real conversation Elaine and I had about Garrett. It was a Sunday afternoon in November, roughly 6 weeks before she passed. Father Dennis Pruitt had come by the house to spend time with her the way he did most Sundays near the end. Father Dennis had served as pastor at St. Brendan's on Isabel Street for over 20 years, and he and Elaine had built the kind of friendship that develops between 2 people who have spent years sitting together in the same room, talking about things that genuinely matter. He was 70 years old, moved without hurry, and never opened his mouth unless he had something worth saying. After he left that afternoon, Elaine asked me to come sit beside her on the bed. I need to walk you through what Franklin and I have been putting together, she said. Her breathing had taken on a deliberateness by then, each breath something she was actively managing. I want you to understand it completely, while I can still explain it. I told her I was listening. She had transferred the deed for the Kensington Drive property into my name 3 weeks before that conversation. Franklin had handled every piece of the paperwork, filed it with the county seen to the signatures and the recording. Under the law, that house had been mine since the first week of November. Garrett and Renee had been living in my house without knowing it. I drew up an occupancy agreement, Elaine said. Franklin helped me get the structure right. Garrett and Renee can stay in the home as long as they want rent-free provided they meet certain conditions. She held my gaze. I am not punishing Garrett. I want that to be clear. I am protecting you. Those are two different things. I told her I understood. The condition that matters, she went on, is the one concerning how they treat you. I told Franklin to put it in plain language. If Garrett or Renee ever raise a hand against you or attempt to intimidate you in that home, their right to stay ends at that exact moment. No courts, no drawn-out process. The police will handle it. Franklin knows precisely what to do when the time comes. I asked her why she'd kept it from me until now. She reached over and straightened my collar the way she had done thousands of times across 41 years. Because you would have pushed back, she said. You would have told me it wasn't needed. You would have lined up a dozen reasons why Garrett deserved another chance. She left her hand resting against my chest for a moment. You're a good man, Len. Good men sometimes need someone to lay a floor under them before they drop through. I poured the coffee and brought it to the kitchen table, full dark outside the window by then. The street was still. I wrapped both hands around the mug, and my mind returned to the parking spot almost a year back. I had pulled into the driveway on Kensington Drive, and Garrett had walked out and announced to Howie DeLuca and 2 cousins who happened to be visiting that I still hadn't grasped basic courtesy after 67 years. I had moved the truck. Standing in my kitchen tonight, I finally saw what I hadn't been able to see then. Garrett hadn't cared about the parking spot. He had never cared about the parking spot. What he was doing in front of Howie and those cousins was staking a claim, telling everyone watching that this was his house now, his rules, that the man who had built that porch and planted the trees shading the drive was a guest, and guests deferred to the host. He had been wrong about every part of that. My phone moved on the table. Owen again. Dad, something slipped my mind. Father Dennis called me this morning, before any of this went sideways. He said he has something he's been holding for you. Something Mom asked him to keep. I set my mug down. Did he say what it was? No. Just that she asked him to hold on to it until he felt the moment was right. Owen paused. He said he thinks today is that moment. I looked out at the darkened street. Elaine had always carried a sense of timing I could never quite get my head around. She knew when to speak and when to let silence do the work. She knew when something needed to move now and when it needed to wait. Even now, from wherever she had gone, it seemed that hadn't changed. I'll call him in the morning, I said. After the line went dead, I glanced at the clock. 6:23 in the evening, out on Kensington Drive. Franklin Eckhart and his people had already been waiting at that front door for 17 minutes, but let me go back to where the day actually began. That morning existed in a kind of bubble sealed off from everything that came before it. I was out of bed before 6:30 years of pre-dawn job sites had wired me that way, and retirement hadn't unwired a thing. I stood at the kitchen counter eating toast, then got in the truck and headed for the party supply store on Brand Boulevard. 3 days earlier, Renee had texted asking whether I could take care of the decorations and drinks. What she'd written was, "We're a little short this month, Dad. You know how it gets." I read those 2 sentences twice. Then I put the phone down on the counter, face down, and left it there for a few minutes. When I picked it back up, I typed 4 words. I'll take care of it. That's what I did. That's what I always did. The store was nearly empty that early, just me and some teenager reorganizing the balloon rack by the door. I tracked down the paper streamers on my own, and then wasted more time than made any sense standing in the tablecloth aisle, weighing blue and white against solid red. Elaine never would have hesitated. That kind of decision came naturally to her, quick sure, no second guessing. I picked blue and white and decided she'd have said the same. 4 cases of iced tea went into the truck bed, 2 bags of ice alongside them, plus the streamers, the tablecloths, a box of napkins printed with small blue stars, cheerful without crossing into garish. $63.40. Cash. Pulling on to Kensington Drive, a little after 8, I spotted Howie DeLuca already at work in his front yard, kneeling over his rose beds with pruning shears in hand. He got to his feet when my truck rumbled past and lifted a hand, but there was a question underneath the gesture. "Early start, Len," he called from the other side of the fence. "Getting things set up," I said. He tilted his chin toward the truck bed. "Want some help hauling that stuff in?" "I'm fine, Howie. Appreciate it, though." He stood there while I unloaded quiet for a stretch. Then, "Did Garrett know you were bringing all this in?" "Renee asked me to handle it," I told him. Howie let out a sound, not a word, exactly just a sound. Then he turned back to his roses. I hauled everything through the side gate and got to work on the backyard by myself. Unfolded the tables, smoothed out the tablecloths, lined up the cups, the way Elaine had always done. It large ones on the left, small ones on the right. Got the charcoal grill lit, dialed in. The heat hung the tongs on the hook where they belonged. An hour and a half, give or take. Nobody came out to lend a hand, nobody stopped by to say good morning, nobody thanked me. I was wiping off the last table when the receipt caught my eye. I'd stepped into the hallway closet in search of extra trash bags, and my foot nudged something on the floor, a discarded bank statement from Elaine's old account, the one Garrett had always sworn he couldn't touch. Printed just 2 days before an unauthorized cash withdrawal of $900 right alongside a boutique receipt for something expensive Renee had stashed upstairs. They weren't stretched thin at all. What they were short on was decency burning through Elaine's savings while asking me to spring for the napkins. I turned on the faucet and held my hands under the running water, staring at that paper for what might have been 15 seconds, though. It registered as considerably longer. Then I dried off, went back outside, and finished setting the cups in their rows. By noon, the backyard had come alive. Cousins streamed in with foil-covered dishes. The children descended on the grass like they'd been waiting all week for permission. Garrett materialized from inside, around 12:30, a soda already in his grip, working the gathering the way he always did. Loud, loose, radiating the easy certainty of a man who assumes any room he enters was arranged for his arrival. I was squaring up the napkin stack when Renee's cousin pressed an invitation card into my hand. "Cute design, right?" she said. Renee did them herself. I looked at what she'd handed me. Cream-colored stock, black lettering, the same font Renee put on everything. A Hargrove family gathering, hosted by Garrett and Renee Hargrove. I went through it once, then again. The tablecloths I was standing on, I'd bought those. The iced tea sweating in the cooler an arm's length away, I'd lugged that in. I had crawled out of bed before 6 Esmarao and driven down to Brand Boulevard and laid out $63.40 of my own money so my son and his wife could throw a party that didn't have my name anywhere near it. I creased the card once down the middle and tucked it into my shirt pocket. When I raised my eyes, Garrett was rounding the corner of the porch. Something in his jaw was clenched, his gaze aimed at a point nowhere near this yard or anyone in it. I clocked it, but the meaning of it hadn't reached me yet. What I pieced together later, he'd gotten a call that morning from a business partner. Something he'd spent the better part of a year building had come apart before the afternoon. He was hauling all of that weight when he swung around the corner and found me there, a drink tray balanced in both hands. Everything that followed took less time than it does to recount. I have turned those 30 seconds over in my head more times than I could ever tally. Not by choice. The mind doesn't ask permission. It just keeps returning to the moments that marked you whether you want to revisit them or not. So, I've replayed that afternoon over and over the way your tongue finds a sore tooth, not because you want the pain, but because you need to know it's still real. Here is what I can tell you. Garrett came around that corner at a clip, moving the way he always moved when something had gotten under his skin. His shoulders nearly touched his ears. His jaw ground in slow circles like he was working through something that wouldn't go down. I'd seen that particular set to his body before it usually preceded words he'd never walk back. I had the tray out in front of me with both hands cups stacked to about 3/4, the whole thing loaded. I shifted right to open up some space between us. It wasn't enough. The tray's edge caught him on the left forearm. A pair of cups broke loose from the right side and cracked against the patio stones. The iced tea fanned out in 2 directions. I heard the hollow slap of the plastic, and I was already reaching for the words already shaping them in my mouth. "I'm sorry, Garrett. I didn't see you coming." The reflexive kind of apology, the kind I'd been handing my son for years over things that had nothing to do with me. I never finished the sentence. He was already pivoting, His right arm swung up and across one unbroken motion, no pause in it, nothing that looked like a decision. The back of his hand landed on the left side of my face, square at the cheekbone. The sound it produced was flat and hard, like a door snapping shut in an empty room. My head whipped sideways from the force. One foot went back to catch myself. The tray stayed in my grip. I couldn't explain to you why I didn't let it fall. Maybe 68 years of holding things steady had made it automatic. Maybe my hands just kept on doing their job while the rest of me tried to understand what had happened. The yard fell silent in a fashion I'd never encountered before that moment and haven't since. Not a slow fade a cut. One instant there was noise, the next there was nothing, as if someone had killed the volume mid-note. The music from the speaker on the back fence was still running. I could just make it out beneath all that stillness, some song I'd never heard. The charcoal grill kept up its low hiss. Somewhere behind me, a child had been in the middle of a laugh. The laugh stopped suspended there, never completed. I brought 2 fingers up to my cheekbone and pressed. The skin was already burning, already pulling tight that first wave heat before the real pain settles in. Construction gave me 30 years of hard lessons about what a body feels when it's been hurt. A finger that snapped on a site in '92. A nail that punched through the heel of my boot in '04 and went partway into the foot. My body knows damage. This was not the same category. This was my son's hand against my face. I lifted my eyes to Garrett. His breath was coming fast and shallow through his nose. His arm was still half raised, elbow crooked, as though it hadn't yet registered that the motion was over. And his eyes, they were wide, and what I saw moving through them told me the rage was already retreating, something else rushing in to fill the space it left behind. Something he couldn't put a label on yet. I had spent a lifetime reading Garrett's face. I believed I had seen every version of it there was to see. I had never come across that one. "Watch where you're going," he said. His voice had dropped to barely a murmur. I didn't respond. Instead, I took in the yard around me, my nephew Clint, who had gone the color of old chalk, Renee's cousin clutching her cup in both hands like she needed something solid to hold on to, 2 of the younger kids who'd stopped running and were rooted to the grass the way children go, still when they sense the adults near them have crossed into territory the children have no map for. Aunt Beverly stood at the folding table with both arms wrapped around her own middle lips, pressed so firmly together the edges had gone white. Her eyes were fixed on me, and what filled them was something close to grief, something close to shame, and underneath both of those, something that looked a lot like anger at Owen. My younger son was at the far corner of the porch back against the wall phone and his right-hand arm held out at about chest height. He hadn't moved. His face had gone to that place I knew the place it went when he was holding himself in one piece by focusing entirely on a single deliberate task. I understood what he was doing. I held Garrett's gaze one more second. Then I lowered the tray onto the nearest table iced tea still spreading around my feet and pulled myself up to my full height. I was 68 years old. I had built structures that were still standing. I had laid my wife in the ground. I had written the checks, logged the miles, absorbed the small humiliations, and told myself every time it was worth it because family was worth it. Garrett looked away first. Renee crossed the yard like she owned it, which I now understood she genuinely believed she did. That was the thing about Renee. For 3 years, she had been operating on a set of assumptions nobody had ever seen fit to challenge directly. And assumptions left unchallenged have a way of hardening into something that feels like fact. She moved between the folding tables with her shoulders squared and her chin level past cousins and children and the cooler I had packed with ice that same morning, and she stopped about 4 FT in front of me. She looked at my face for exactly 1 second. Then she looked somewhere else. That 1 second told me everything about Renee I needed to know. She had seen the mark. She knew what it was and what had put it there. And in that single second, she had made her choice to act as though she hadn't seen a thing. "Dad," she said in the careful modulated tone she brought out when she wanted to come across as the reasonable one in the room. "I think this has gotten a little out of hand. Why don't we all just take a breath?" "He struck me, Renee." "You startled him." She tilted her head a fraction. "You know how much pressure he's been under. The business situation has been brutal, and honestly, the way you came around that corner, Renee. I said her name the way you set something heavy on a table, not raised, just final." She stopped talking. I looked at her, and I thought about the camera she had put up in the living room of this house in her second week home with the newborn. The lens trained on the space where I was spending my days caring for that child. 11 months of Bottles Park visits, wooden blocks on the floor, all of it recorded, while she scanned the footage for something she could use against me. I thought about the receipt I had found on the kitchen counter that morning, $830 for a handbag. On the exact same day she had texted me that they were a little short this month. I thought about the invitation card folded in my breast pocket. Garrett had come to stand beside her, now arms folded, jaw reset into something that passed for composure. The people around us were doing what crowds do when they desperately want to be elsewhere, but can't bring themselves to leave small, unconscious adjustments. Weight shifting from foot to foot, eyes dropping to the ground, hands disappearing into pockets. Aunt Beverly hadn't moved an inch. She was watching me from across the yard with an expression I couldn't entirely read, but that seemed to carry a question inside it. "What are you going to do, Len?" "I'd like you to apologize to Garrett," Renee said. Her voice had stiffened, the veneer of reasonableness thinning at the seams. "We can all move past this and enjoy the rest of the afternoon. I think that's what everyone here wants." I noticed how she said everyone here, the way her eyes swept the gathered relatives as the words left her mouth. She was making a point, reminding me that I was outnumbered, reminding me that these same people had been standing by for 3 years while Garrett treated me the way he treated me, and not one of them had raised a voice about it. That unbroken record of silence was something she fully expected to hold. What she didn't know, what she had no way of knowing, was what that silence had cost her. Because here is what I knew, standing in that backyard with iced tea drying on my shoes and my son's handprint burning into my cheekbone. The house on Kensington Drive, the house Garrett and Renee had been entertaining their guests in all afternoon. The house whose backyard we were currently occupying had my name on the deed at the Los Angeles County Recorder's Office. It had carried my name there for the past 10 months. Every assumption Renee had built her life around for the past 3 years was sitting on a foundation that simply did not exist. She just hadn't found that out yet. I reached into my breast pocket and pulled out the invitation card. I held it a moment, feeling the weight of the cardstock between my fingers. Then I laid it on the table beside me, face up, so the words Garrett and Renee Hargrove hosts were legible to anyone standing near enough to look. "No," I said. Renee blinked. It was the first unguarded expression I'd gotten from her all afternoon. "Excuse me?" "No." Same word, same weight. "I'm not going to apologize." Garrett's face moved through several things in fast succession. Surprise, then irritation. Then the particular cold fury of a man who expected someone to fold and has just discovered they haven't. "Then I need you to leave," Renee said. The measured tone was gone entirely now. "I need you to leave our home." I looked at her for a long beat. Our home. I picked up the 2 cups from the patio stones and set them on the table. I untied the apron I'd put on that morning while setting up the grill, folded it once and draped it over the back of a chair. Then I walked to the side gate, the one I'd built, and hung myself in the summer of 2002, using hardware I had sourced from the supply house on Victory Boulevard because I'd wanted it to last. It had lasted. Behind me, I heard Garrett say something to Renee in a low voice. She made a sound that might have been a laugh. I pushed the gate open, stepped through, and drew it shut at my back. The latch snapped into place with a sound like a period at the end of a very long sentence. I was halfway to my truck when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I didn't break stride. I already knew I'd answer it this time. Then I glanced at the screen and stopped where I stood. It wasn't Franklin's number. Renee had posted a photograph. I could read the notification preview from where I stood in the street. The image showed the backyard packed with smiling faces, paper plates, the grill visible in the background. The caption said, "Family time is everything." The timestamp showed it had gone up 4 minutes ago. 4 minutes ago, I had been standing in that same yard with her husband's handprint on my face. I stood on the sidewalk outside the house that had my name on the deed and looked at that photograph for a long time. Then I slid the phone into my pocket, climbed into my truck, and drove without looking back. 3 blocks down, I pulled over. Not to collect myself, I needed both hands free to make a call. I was not the kind of man who drove and talked at the same time, not since Elaine had asked me to stop doing that 12 years ago. I had agreed, and I had kept my word. I eased the truck to a stop on a quiet block of Cypress Street, 2 blocks shy of home engine idling. Through the windshield, the September light in Glendale had shifted into that deep amber you only get when the sun slips behind the Verdugo Mountains and bathes everything for about 40 minutes in something warm and golden before the evening takes over. Elaine had a name for that window of time. She called it the forgiving hour because she believed nothing looked truly ugly inside it. Forgiveness was not what I was feeling. I scrolled to Franklin's number and made the call. Second ring he picked up, Mr. Hargrove. Calm, unhurried. No trace of surprise, no question attached, just my name, spoken like something already known. "I'm ready to talk," I said. I thought that might be coming. A short pause on his end. "Are you somewhere you can speak freely? I'm parked on Cypress Street in my truck. That'll do?" A soft sound chair, legs shifting, papers moved out of the way. Franklin was the kind of man who didn't split his attention. Whatever you brought him, he gave it everything. "Tell me what happened." I laid it out for him. I kept the account brief because the events themselves were brief. Garrett and I collided. He hit me across the face. 30 people were standing there when it happened. Renee told me to either apologize or go. I went. Franklin gave that a moment of silence. "Then, I need to ask you plainly. Are you hurt?" "There's a bruise coming up on my left cheekbone. Otherwise, I'm fine. I'd like that on record. Can you photograph your face tonight and send it to my office line before you turn in?" "I can do that." "Good." Another pause. "Mr. Hargrove, as you and I have talked about before, the occupancy agreement that Mrs. Hargrove signed contains an immediate termination clause. A standard lease would require you to go through the courts, but Garrett and Renee Hargrove are licensees. No tenancy rights, no rent paid. They are in that house solely because you, as the legal owner, have permitted it. Under California law, a licensee's right to remain can be pulled at any time for any reason. And this particular agreement goes further. It states that revocation becomes automatic the moment there is verified evidence of physical harm directed at you. Owen sent you a video." "He did," I said. "About 40 minutes ago. The footage is clear. No room for interpretation." Franklin paused again. "I want to make sure you fully understand what you're setting in motion, Mr. Hargrove. The moment my team goes to that property, there's no pulling them back. New locks go on. The notice gets served. Garrett and Renee will have to leave and come back for their belongings within the window the agreement sets out. Once the door opens, it doesn't close again." I gazed out at the amber street beyond the glass. My mind went back to that morning, spreading out the tablecloths, hauling in the iced tea, handing over $63.40 in cash at the party store on Brand Boulevard. I thought about the invitation card with 2 names printed on it, a blank where a third name could have sat. I thought about $830 charged to a card and a camera mounted in a living room and a text that read, "We're a little short this month." And I thought about Elaine in that hospital bed, her breathing slow and deliberate, telling me that decent men needed a solid floor beneath them before the ground gave way. She had laid that floor for me. My part was simply to get up and stand on it. "Franklin," I said, "get it started tonight." A beat of quiet on the line. Then, "Understood. Mr. Hargrove, my team will be there before they get back." Plainer words than I'd expected, but certain decisions don't call for anything elaborate. They only call for a yes. Franklin continued, "I'll have everyone assembled and at the house within the hour ahead of Garrett and Renee returning from the gathering. One more thing, Owen Hargrove attached a written statement to the video. He says he was there for the whole thing, and he's prepared to stand up and say so in any proceeding that might require it." Something tightened in my chest, the way it had earlier that afternoon, pride braided with an ache I couldn't name cleanly. "That's entirely his decision," I said. "I never asked him for any of it." "I know you didn't," Franklin said. "That's precisely why it carries the weight it does." We wrapped up the call. I stayed in the truck another minute, engine still turning over, palms resting flat on the steering wheel. Down the block, someone's irrigation had come on, sweeping long arcs of water back and forth across a front lawn in unhurried rhythm. A kid on a bicycle swung around the corner, rose up off the seat to muscle over a small incline, and was gone around the next bend. An ordinary Saturday on an ordinary street, the rest of the world moving along entirely undisturbed. I dropped it into drive, one errand before home, get the photograph taken in decent light, and get it off to Franklin's office. After that, I intended to pour a cup of coffee settle into my own kitchen and meet whatever came next without backing away from it. 31 years as a contractor had taught me the logic of demolition. First, you identify the structure that can no longer carry the load. You get it documented, then you bring it down the right way, clean and controlled, so what replaces it can actually hold. The amber was draining out of the sky as I left the curb. Another 40 minutes and Glendale would be in full dark. Out on Kensington Drive, three strangers by any real measure were climbing into a car to head home to a house they had no legal claim on. My phone showed 11 unread messages by the time I pulled into my own driveway. I stayed behind the wheel a while, reading the screen in what remained of the light. Most were from cousins and extended family people I hadn't had a real private conversation with in months. A couple came from numbers I had to study before I could place them. One was from my nephew Clint, who hadn't reached out to me directly in more than a year. I went through them in sequence. The early ones were brief. "Hope you're okay, Len. Thinking about you. Sorry for what happened." The kind of words people reach for when they want you to feel their presence but aren't ready to take a side. I'd composed messages like that myself across the years, and I wasn't going to hold it against anyone now. The later ones ran longer. Clint wrote, "I should have spoken up. I've been sitting with it ever since you left, and I just need you to know. I'm sorry I stayed quiet." Renee's cousin, the one who'd put the invitation card in my hand, wrote, "What Garrett did was wrong. I need you to know that I see that." Then she added, "Please don't think we all share his view of things." I wasn't certain I caught every layer of what she meant, but I was grateful she'd said it. Aunt Beverly hadn't texted. She'd called. I moved to the armchair beside the front window and listened to what she'd left. Her voice had that wound-tight quality, the sound of someone who has spent several hours keeping tears at bay through sheer will. "Leonard," she said, "I want you to know that I went and found Garrett after you walked out. I told him point blank what I'd seen with my own eyes. He told me I had it wrong. I told him my eyes work fine, and I know what I looked at." A pause. "I also need to say that I should have stepped in the second it happened. I didn't do that. I'm not going to dress it up with reasons. I just want you to know I'm sorry, and I love you, and Elaine would not have been quiet the way I was today." The voicemail ended. I put the phone face down on the armrest and stared at the ceiling for a stretch. Owen rang at 7:15. "Dad, you home? I'm home." Good. I could make out movement in the background, a car door thudding shut, the blur of traffic. "Okay? I'm going to walk you through what happened after you left, and I'm asking you to let me finish before you say anything. Go ahead." He drew a breath. "Garrett started making the rounds about 5 minutes after you went out the gate. His version was that you walked into him deliberately, that you've carried a grudge for years, and this was just you engineering a moment." There was an edge in Owen's voice I rarely heard. Some people went along with it. That's just how crowds work. Nobody wants to be the one who escalates. But then Aunt Beverly crossed the yard and went right up to him, and she said, I'm giving you her exact words because I was close enough to hear every one of them. She said, "Garrett, I have known your father for 40 years, and I have never once seen him go looking for trouble. What I witnessed today was a man who got struck and kept his hands at his sides. What I was about to learn that evening would cut deeper than the bruise on my face. It would change the way I understood everything that had happened and everything that had been done to me without my knowing. Before we get there, I want to ask you something. If you suspected someone close to you had been quietly working against you, would you say something right away? Or would you wait and let the truth surface on its own? And you need to sit with what that says about the two of you." I let a slow breath out. Garrett told her she was being dramatic, Owen went on. She said she'd seen enough, then walked to her car. After that, the party just sort of, he paused, went flat. Nobody bolted, but the laughter was gone. People started drifting off around 6:00. By 6:30, the yard had cleared out, and Garrett and Renee were loading up the SUV when I headed out. Garrett was in good spirits somehow. He was telling Renee you'd probably ring him tomorrow, carrying on like the afternoon had been perfectly normal. Owen's voice dropped into something toneless. He said, "People like him never stay mad." I shut my eyes. People like him. 68 years. Everything I had built given fixed funded, never once asking for anything in return. And that was the conclusion my son had reached. I was a type, a reliable pattern, something that could be counted on to absorb whatever was thrown at it and show back up in time for the next occasion. Dad Owen said quietly. "Howie DeLuca called me about 20 minutes ago. He said there are people over at the house on Kensington Drive. A man in a suit, someone carrying a toolbox. Said it had an official look to it." "It is official," I said. A long pause on Owen's end of the line. "Are you okay?" I gave that question some genuine thought before I answered. Was I okay? My face throbbed. There was a heaviness in my chest, the particular kind that comes not from bearing a load, but from having just set one down when the muscles are still braced for the weight that's no longer there. "I think I will be," I said. "Eventually." "That's good enough for now," Owen said. After we finished the call, I checked the time, 6:47. I pushed up from the chair and went to the bathroom mirror and looked at myself under the light. The bruise had come in, fully a dark stain spreading from my cheekbone down toward the jaw, deepest purple at the center and fading to yellow at the edges. I took the photograph Franklin had asked for and sent it to his office line without looking at it again. Then, I went to the kitchen and set the stovetop espresso pot on the burner the old-fashioned way because Elaine never trusted drip machines. Outside, the neighborhood had gone completely dark. Out on Kensington Drive, if Howie DeLuca's account held a white sedan and an unfamiliar van were sitting at the curb in front of a house with a light still burning in the front room, Garrett and Renee would be pulling up within the hour. Franklin reached me at 8:14 that evening. I was at the kitchen table with my second cup of coffee going cold in front of me. His name appeared on the screen, and I had it answered before the second ring was done. "It's done, Mr. Hargrove. I'd like to walk you through what happened if you have a few minutes." "I have time," I said. "Tell me everything." He did. Franklin laid it out with the kind of precision he brought to everything, and as he spoke, I built the scene in my head from his words. The way I once built structures from blueprints detail by detail, until the whole thing was standing solid in front of me. Franklin and his team had reached Kensington Drive at 7:03, three of them all together. Franklin himself, in what he called his work clothes, the dark suit he wore to every professional engagement, regardless of the hour. A licensed courier named Daryl, who handled the formal document service carrying a sealed envelope with Garrett's name on the front. And a locksmith named Kolb, who had done similar work with Franklin's firm before arriving with a toolbox and 2 new lock cylinders already matched to the property. They had parked along the street and waited. Howie DeLuca appeared at his front fence almost immediately, Franklin said. Franklin introduced himself, briefly gave a general outline of what was unfolding. Howie gave a single nod, said, "About time," and went back to his porch chair, where he settled in and did not go inside for the duration. Garrett and Renee arrived at 7:29. Franklin said he heard the SUV before he could see it, the engine decelerating as it swung onto the block. The headlights swept across the three of them on the front walkway. The vehicle rolled into the driveway and sat idling for a moment. Then Garrett climbed out. Franklin said he covered the ground between them with the stride of a man who has already decided in advance that whatever he's walking into is either someone's mistake or someone else's problem. Hands loose, still in the clothes from the barbecue. He came to a stop about 8 ft away and regarded the three of them with an expression Franklin described as impatient. "Can I help you?" Garrett said. Franklin introduced himself, offered his card, explained he was there, representing the property owner. Garrett laughed. Franklin said it was the quick, assured laugh of someone who believes they are about to watch another person realize they've gotten things confused, the owner, Garrett said. "I think there's been some kind of mix-up here." Renee had stepped out of the passenger side by then and come around the front of the vehicle to stand beside him. She looked at Franklin differently than Garrett did. Franklin noted less impatient, more measured the way someone looks when they are quietly reading a situation before committing themselves to a response. Franklin asked them to confirm their names for the record. Garrett did. Renee did. Franklin took the sealed envelope from Daryl and extended it toward Garrett. Garrett took it with one hand and looked at the front, and something in his face shifted. Franklin said it was the kind of shift you see when a confident expression runs into something it wasn't prepared for. Garrett's name on the front. Below it, the address of the Kensington Drive property, and below that, the name of the law firm, and below that, in language that left no room for interpretation, the words, "Estate of Elaine Hargrove, property owner Leonard Hargrove." Franklin said Garrett stood there without moving for about 4 seconds. Then he tore the envelope open. He read the first page on the walkway in the porch light. Franklin watched his eyes track across the lines and stop, go back to the top, and start again. His jaw had locked up. A muscle ticked along his cheek. Renee stepped in close and craned to see over his shoulder. Garrett turned slightly away from her, involuntary. Franklin said the motion of a man who processes a bad turn privately before he shares it. Then Garrett flipped to the page with the protection clause. Franklin said he watched Garrett read that page twice slowly, all the way through both times. When Garrett raised his eyes, his face had done something Franklin said he had only come across a handful of times in 30 years of estate law. It had gone entirely still. Not angry, not combative, still. the look of a mind racing at full speed through a very short list of exits and finding every one of them sealed. "This is not possible," Garrett said. His voice had changed quieter and rougher at once. "It is fully documented," Franklin said. "The deed was recorded with the Los Angeles County Recorder's Office in November of last year. Your mother transferred ownership to your father at that time. The occupancy agreement was signed by both your parents and witnessed by 2 members of our firm." Renee had the papers from Garrett by then and was reading the protection clause herself, lips moving faintly. Franklin said her expression went through several things over the course of about 10 seconds. Surprise came first, then something that looked like calculation, then something that settled closer to fear than anything else. "We signed this," she said. Not a question. A statement, the sound of someone confirming to herself something she hadn't thought about in a long while. "You did," Franklin said. "Both of you in this office 14 months ago." Garrett looked at the house. Franklin said he looked at it the way a person looks at something they've just understood, they never genuinely held. His shoulders dropped about an inch. Whatever certainty had carried him through that afternoon, through the barbecue, the drive home, the walk up the front path, drained out of his body so plainly that Franklin said he could mark almost the precise moment it left him. Cobb, the locksmith, lifted his toolbox and started toward the front door. Garrett turned. "What is he doing?" "Changing the locks," Franklin said, "as the agreement specifies." Garrett took one step in the direction of the door. Cobb slid the first cylinder into the lock, worked the tool, and the old hardware came free in his hands. The new cylinder seated itself with a sequence of small, precise clicks that carried cleanly down the quiet street. Garrett stopped where he was for the first time since he had stepped out of that driveway. He had nothing left to say. "Franklin told me that part last." Then he added, "It went exactly as your wife intended it to go, Mr. Hargrove." I sat at the kitchen table with the cold coffee in front of me and didn't speak for a moment. "Thank you, Franklin," I finally said, "for everything." "Get some rest," he told me. "The documentation will be in your email by morning." I was still at that table when Owen called again. 8:41. I knew because I'd been watching the microwave clock the way you watch a clock when you're waiting for something to end and aren't entirely sure what you'll feel when it does. Franklin's call had wrapped up 19 minutes earlier. The coffee in my cup had gone stone cold, and I hadn't moved to pour a fresh one. "Dad." Owen's voice was different from the last time, wound tighter like something had just broken open that he was still working through as he spoke. "I'm out on Kensington Drive. Drove over after we got off the phone. I had to see it." I straightened up in my chair. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine. I'm in my car down the block from the house." He let out a breath. "Dad." I watched the whole thing from here. Franklin and his people, the locksmith, all of it. A pause. Garrett completely fell apart. I waited about 20 minutes after they served the papers. He started making calls. I could see him from where I was sitting, back and forth, across the driveway with his phone out. First call went to Uncle Ned. I couldn't make out the words, but I could see his hands. Owen paused. His hands were doing a lot of the talking. What did Ned say? Hard to know exactly. But whatever it was, Garrett cut it short fast. Then he rang Clint. Another pause. Clint didn't pick up. Then he tried someone else. I couldn't tell who. That one went straight to voicemail. Then he called Aunt Beverly. I set my coffee cup down very carefully. "He had it on speaker," Owen said. "I think he wanted Renee to hear, or maybe he just stopped thinking about it. But it was loud enough that Howie DeLuca sitting on his porch about 30 FT away turned his head." "What did she say?" Owen went quiet for a second. When he came back, there was something in his voice that wasn't quite a laugh, but was somewhere in that neighborhood. She said, "Garrett, I watched you strike your father in front of 30 people this afternoon. I watched your wife tell him to apologize or leave. And now you're calling me to do what exactly? Tell a lawyer. It didn't happen." "Ik bestees by de Westfarid." A pause. Then she said, "I have been quiet in this family for too long about too many things. I am not going to be quiet about this one." And she hung up. I pressed 2 fingers against my mouth and looked up at the ceiling. Garrett just stood in the driveway for about 10 seconds after that. Owen went on, completely still, phone at his side. Howie was watching him from the porch. Neither of them said a word. Owen paused. Then Garrett turned and threw his phone into the passenger seat of the SUV. Not with enough force to break it, but enough that Renee flinched. I held onto that image for a moment. I thought about what it told you that she'd been living alongside his temper, long enough to read its thresholds precisely. After that, they went inside to pack some things, Owen said. Franklin's team held their position on the walkway. The locksmith stayed at the door. Owen took a breath. It took them about 40 minutes. They came out carrying 2 suitcases and some bags. Renee had Caden's backpack with her. His voice snagged slightly on that. The blue one with the triceratops on the front. I closed my eyes. Caden's backpack, the blue one with the triceratops on the front, that I had picked out with him for his 4th birthday because he had planted himself in that store aisle for 20 minutes, delivering a full account of the difference between a diplodocus and a brachiosaurus with the complete authority of a child who has just learned something he considers urgently important. I had listened to every word. I had bought the backpack and let him carry it out of the store himself. They drove away at 9:12, Owen said quietly. Garrett didn't look back at the house. Renee did once just before she got in. We were both quiet for a stretch. Outside the kitchen window, the neighborhood had gone dark and still. "There's one more thing," Owen said. "About 15 minutes after they left, a voicemail came in for you through the property line. Franklin forwarded it to me. It was from Renee." "What did she say?" Owen read it off his phone. Renee's voice, he said, was soft, measured, carefully controlled. She said she was sorry for everything that had happened. She said she wanted Leonard to know she had never intended for things to reach this point. She said there were some papers in the study filing cabinet behind the desk that belonged to Garrett's business, and she would really appreciate it if Leonard could set them somewhere accessible because Garrett needed them right away, and they were time sensitive. I sat with that for a moment. Not an apology, an errand. The words had been arranged to carry the shape of remorse, but the ask buried in the middle of them was as calculated as everything else Renee had ever done. She needed something from inside that house, and she addressed the need up in the language of regret because that was the instrument she had to work with. "Dad," Owen said. "Forward it to Franklin," I said. "Don't answer it, and don't let me answer it either. Franklin will know what to do with it." "Already sent it," Owen said. I figured. After we ended the call, I stayed at the kitchen table for a long while. The microwave clock read 9:47. The house around me had settled into the particular quiet that small houses find late at night, the deep stillness of walls and floors that have absorbed a full day and gone to rest. Then my phone buzzed once more. Unknown number. I let it roll to voicemail. I didn't listen to it that night. 3 days later, I would find out who it was and what they were after, but that was still ahead of me, and I didn't know it yet. I got up, poured the cold coffee down the drain, and went to bed. For the first time in a long while, I was asleep before the hour turned. The 3 days that followed were quieter than I'd expected, not peaceful. Quiet and peaceful are 2 different things. Peaceful is what settles over you when something has resolved itself, and the people caught up in it have come through to somewhere better. Quiet is what you get when the noise stops, but the full weight of everything that made the noise is still sitting on the kitchen table, and you move around it with care because you haven't decided yet what to do with it. I kept to my routine. I watered the potted marigolds on my front porch that Elaine had planted this spring before she got sick. I drove to the hardware store on Central Avenue and replaced a set of drill bits I'd been putting off for months. I called my doctor's office and made an appointment to have the bruise on my cheek formally documented as Franklin had suggested in a follow-up email Monday morning. By Tuesday, the bruise had shifted from purple to a deep greenish yellow, the kind that made the woman at the pharmacy counter glance at me and then carefully look away with the particular tact of someone who has decided that whatever they're seeing is none of their business. Owen came over Monday morning as I'd asked. I made coffee and we sat at the kitchen table and didn't touch the weekend directly for the first 20 minutes. We talked about his students he taught 7th grade English at a school in Sun Valley and about a book he'd been reading, and about whether the roses along the back fence on Kensington Drive were going to need attention before the season shifted. Ordinary talk, the kind that people who know each other well use to take the temperature of a room before they commit to walking all the way into it. Eventually, Owen set his cup down and said, "Franklin called me this morning." "What did he say?" "He said the paperwork is all in order. The termination notice has been formally served. Garrett and Renee have 30 days to come back for the rest of their belongings under supervised conditions." He paused. He also said Renee's voicemail has been logged as part of the record. Said it was, and I'm quoting him, instructive. I nodded. "Dad." Owen leaned forward slightly. "Are you going to be okay?" "Not about the house, about Garrett." I looked down at my coffee cup. "I don't know yet," I said. "Ask me in a few months." He accepted that without pushing. He had always known how to sit with an incomplete answer and not reach for the rest. Elaine had been the same way. It was something I had been quietly grateful for in both of them. Time moved the way it does when you're waiting for something you can't name. Wednesday evening found me in the armchair near the front window, with a book open in my lap, a thing I hadn't managed on a weeknight in more years than I wanted to count when the phone on the side table lit up and buzzed. Unknown number, the same one that had tried me Sunday night. This time, I picked up. Renee. Not the version of her I'd seen at the barbecue, measured and deliberate. Not the careful construction she'd left on my voicemail. This was something underneath all that, unpolished, slightly frantic, the sound of someone who'd been burning through reserve fuel for 3 days straight and had just hit the bottom of the tank. I need you to listen to me. Go ahead, I said. This has gone far enough. What you did was cruel and you know it. We have a child. We have Caden. You put your grandson out on the street over a misunderstanding, and I want you to sit with what that tells you about the kind of man you are. I didn't answer her. Instead, I reached over, pressed the speaker button, and rested the phone on the armrest. Owen was 6 feet away, leaning in the kitchen doorway with a cup of coffee in both hands. He'd caught her voice the moment I answered and hadn't moved since. Renee pressed on. I have been patient with you, Len, patient for years. But hear me on this: if you believe I'll simply let this go, you're badly mistaken. I will go to every single person in that family and tell them what kind of father you really were to Garrett. I'll lay out every year he struggled because your pride kept you from stepping in when it counted. I'll tell them all. Renee, I said, quietly, just her name. She went silent. 3 years ago, I wired $6,400 out of my retirement savings to keep the lights and gas on at your house, I said. I have the transfer records. Franklin holds copies. I let a beat pass. And I spent 11 months living under your roof, looking after your son, while you had cameras mounted in the living room to build a case against me. I'm aware of those cameras, Renee. I've been aware for some time. The line dropped into a deep quiet. From the doorway, Owen watched me without blinking. The coffee cup was white-knuckled in his grip. His jaw had that particular set to it, the same one his mother used to get when something landed hard and she was still deciding exactly how to answer it. That is not, Renee began. I want to be plain with you, I said. I have no desire to keep going with this call. What I'm going to do is hang up, then send this recording over to Franklin Eckhart's office, same as I sent your voicemail. Then I'm going to sit back down and finish my chapter. A long silence stretched out. When she came back on, something had shifted fundamentally. The warmth, the controlled resentment, the performance, all of it had drained away. What remained was flat. You think you've won something? She said. You haven't. I don't think I've won anything, I told her. I think I've stopped losing. Those aren't the same thing. I ended the call. Owen placed his cup on the kitchen counter, one small, deliberate sound. Then he crossed the room and crouched down in front of my chair in a way he hadn't since he was around 9 years old, back when he had something difficult to say and wasn't certain I'd want to hear it. Dad. His voice came out unsteady. I didn't know about the cameras. I know that. I should have, Owen. I laid my hand on his shoulder. You got footage of your brother hitting your father to a lawyer without anyone telling you to. You turned up in a dark street at night to make sure the thing unfolded right. You've been planning yourself in my kitchen for 3 days running to make sure I'm eating. I met his eyes. You've done enough, son. More than enough. His jaw tightened and he dropped his gaze to the floor. His shoulders were moving barely, but I could see it. The trembling of someone who has kept himself intact for 72 hours solid and has just been handed permission to let go of it. After a moment, he looked back up. Father Dennis Pruitt called again today, he said. He said whenever you're ready. I gave a slow nod. Through the dark glass of the window, the street sat still and empty, and I found myself thinking about Elaine, about the quiet ways she'd laid things in my path that I wouldn't understand I needed until much later. I'll reach out to him tomorrow morning, I said. Howie DeLuca showed up on Thursday with a paper bag of tomatoes fresh out of his garden. That was Howie's whole approach to friendship. No advance notice, no message sent. He materialized at your front door holding something he'd grown or built or cooked, and if you were there, you waved him in, and if you weren't, he tucked a note on the porch, written on whatever scrap happened to be riding in his shirt pocket. A receipt from the gas station, half an envelope, something. I'd known the man more than 20 years, and I genuinely could not think of one time he'd come to a door without something in his hands. I put on coffee, and the two of us settled at the kitchen table, the unhurried way men in their 70s do on a Thursday, with nowhere particular to be and nothing pressing at the door. He'd seen it all from his porch the night it went down, he said. The attorney, the locksmith, the documents. He'd watch Garrett and Renee fill the back of their SUV and pull away down the block. Watch the locksmith work back through the front door and the side gate one last time before loading up his van. Howie had stayed put in that chair until the street had gone dark and still, and the light inside the front room of the house on Kensington Drive had finally been switched off by someone from Franklin's crew heading out. 22 years, I've had eyes on that house, Len, Howie said. He cupped both hands around his mug the way he always did, whether it was cold out or not. I watched you put in that back fence board by board, watched Elaine put in those roses, watched you redo the porch railing twice because you weren't satisfied until it was right. He paused. And I watched things go on over there these past 3 years that deserved a word from me, and I never gave one. Howie, I'm not finished. He kept his eyes on the mug. I watched Garrett address you like you were someone he'd hired. Watched Renee move through your own family gatherings without so much as acknowledging you were in the room. Watched you haul groceries in and walk back out with nobody offering so much as a thank you, and I lost count of how many times. He shook his head slow and deliberate. I kept telling myself it was none of my concern. That's what we say to ourselves, Len. Not my business. But the moment a man takes a hit in his own yard and the people around him act like nothing happened, that's when it stops being a private matter, like it or not. On the counter sat the tomatoes he'd brought still in their bag. The ones he put in every summer, down along his south fence, dense and dark red, a little lopsided with a kind of flavor that reminded you what a tomato was actually supposed to taste like. Nothing like what you pulled off a grocery shelf. Next morning, I was up early. Howie went on, and the lights were burning over there. Franklin's team, I figured, going through things and getting it squared away. He nodded quietly to himself. Then, somewhere around 11, Garrett pulled up in a truck. A rental. Had a younger fellow riding with him, nobody I'd ever seen. The two of them headed inside and started bringing things out. Franklin set up supervised removal, I said. I was told. There was a woman from his office parked out front the whole stretch, just sitting there in her car clipboard in her lap. Howie wrapped his hands around the mug again. 4 hours or so back and forth. Boxes, bags, a few pieces of furniture. The younger one did the heavy work. Garrett walked around pointing. A pause. Renee never showed, just Garrett. I let that sit in my mind for a moment. Garrett by himself, ferrying boxes into a rented truck on a Tuesday, while a woman with a clipboard outside kept inventory of what he was and wasn't entitled to take. Right before he drove off, Howie said he stopped in the driveway, stood there maybe 5 minutes just looking at the place. He set his mug down with both hands. I was working the hedge probably closer than he figured. Neither of us said a word. But I had a clear view of his face, Len. He waited. He looked like a man who'd finally understood something, but understood it about 3 steps past the point where it would have done him any good. Howie said quietly. Not quite sorry, not there yet, but starting to feel the gap between the position he'd imagined he was standing in and the one he was actually standing in. Howie looked across the table at me. You recognize that look. Enough years in construction, you've seen it. It's the face a man makes when he finds a crack running through a wall he was absolutely certain would hold. I knew that look well. Then he climbed into the truck, Howie said, and pulled away down the street without a single glance back at the house. Not once. We let that settle between us. Outside, a mockingbird had started up in the liquid amber tree at the edge of my yard, cycling through its full range with the unhurried confidence of a creature that performs for its own satisfaction, regardless of whether anyone is listening. How are you holding up, Len? Howie asked. Not the way you ask it to fill a pause. The way you ask it when you actually want to know. I gave it real thought before I answered. Better than last week, I said. Not as well as I expect to be a month from now. Howie dipped his head, like that was exactly the kind of answer a sensible man would give. He lifted his mug. Elaine would have handled all of this differently, he said. She'd have seen where it was heading a good 2 years sooner and stepped in before it ever reached this point. Yeah, she did see it coming, I said. She just went about it in her own way. Howie studied me for a moment, then a small, certain smile crossed his face, the smile of someone who has just had a suspicion confirmed. Good for her, he said. We finished the coffee. Howie carried his mug to the sink and rinsed it without being asked the way he always did. He gathered his bag, pulled on his jacket, and we walked together to the front door. Out on the porch, he paused looking down the block toward Kensington Drive. From where we stood, you couldn't make out the house itself, only the crown of the liquid amber in the front yard and the upper edge of the roofline above the fence. As those roses Elaine put in along the back fence are going to want cutting before winter sets in, he said. I know, I said. I'll see to it. He gave one nod and went down the porch steps heading back toward his place. I stood in the doorway and watched him go, a 71-year-old man moving at his own unhurried pace, empty bag swinging at his side. The phone rang before I'd even gotten the door shut. Father Dennis Pruitt. Leonard, he said. His voice carried that particular warmth and ease that comes from 50 years of sitting with people at the hardest moments of their lives. I think the time has come. Can you make it to the church? I looked down the street one more time. Morning light was catching the top of the liquid amber. 20 minutes, Father, I said. St. Brendan's was 12 minutes from my front door on a calm morning. I had made that drive so many times across 30 years that my hands took the turns on their own left, on Central Avenue right on Isabel Street, then into the lot behind the church, where an old eucalyptus shed its bark in long, pale strips every summer. Elaine used to crouch down and pick a strip up and hold it to her nose before letting it fall again, because she said it smelled like something she recognized but couldn't find a name for. I pulled into the same spot we'd always used, second row back left. Pure habit. The church was nearly empty at that hour. An older man I didn't know sat near the rear of the nave with his head lowered. The light inside had that quality that belongs to old buildings, thick and filtered, arriving through the stained glass on the south wall, in slow bands of color that crept across the stone floor. So gradually, you had to be still a long time before you noticed they had moved at all. On ordinary mornings, Elaine and I had always taken the fourth pew on the left. I didn't sit there today. I stopped in the aisle for a moment and looked at it, then walked on toward the back of the sacristy, where Father Dennis kept his small office. He was already standing in the doorway when I reached it, as though he had tracked my footsteps from the moment I came through the entrance. 70 years old, with the particular kind of quiet that belongs to a man who has spent 5 decades learning how to be fully present in a painful room without making the room about himself. He took my hand in both of his and said nothing about the bruise still fading on my cheekbone. I was grateful for that. Come in, Leonard, he said. The office was small and warm shelves covering 3 walls a desk that had clearly been in that spot since well before the current century. 2 chairs set facing each other with no desk between them. He'd arranged it that way on purpose, I understood. He wasn't meeting me across a piece of furniture. He was sitting with me. He opened the top drawer of the desk and lifted out a cream envelope, letter-sized, sealed. My name was on the front in Elaine's handwriting. I would have known it anywhere, the way she made the capital L just slightly taller than it needed to be, the trailing curl at the bottom of the Y dropping just below the line with a neat little hook. I had read that handwriting on shopping lists and birthday cards and the notes she'd leave propped against something on my workbench when she had something to tell me, but didn't want to interrupt whatever I had going. I held the envelope in my hands without opening it. She brought it to me in November, Father Dennis said quietly. About 2 weeks before she passed. She told me she'd written it some months prior and had been thinking about when to pass it along. He paused. She said she would know when the moment was right, and that if she was no longer in a position to judge that herself, she trusted me to judge it for her. I kept my eyes on the envelope. She also told me something else, he said. She told me you were the finest man she had ever known, and that she was sorry she couldn't stay, and that she had done everything in her power to make sure you wouldn't be left without what you needed. His voice never wavered. She said she knew you'd try to carry it all on your own. She said she'd done her best to build something that could carry part of the load in your place. I ran my thumb slowly along the sealed edge. Father Dennis rose from his chair. I'll step out and give you some time, he said. There's coffee on the table just outside if you'd like it. He laid his hand briefly on my shoulder as he moved past the gesture of a man who understands that saying more would be saying less. And then he was gone, the door resting just barely ajar behind him, and I was alone in that warm, still room, with my wife's handwriting resting in my palms. I opened the envelope, 2 pages written on the same cream paper she reserved for anything that mattered. Her hand was a little less sure than usual, in places the letters running slightly larger in those spots, and that told me she had written it when her hands were already beginning to fail her. She wrote it anyway. She opened by writing about the house. She had turned it over in her mind for a long time, longer than I'd ever realized, and her decision had come not from any bitterness toward Garrett, but from a clear-eyed view of who he had become and where things were heading if nothing intervened. She wrote that she had watched me absorb his behavior for years, silent about it because I loved him, because I held on to the belief that the boy she had raised was still present somewhere inside the man he had grown into. She wrote that she had held that same belief and hoped it was right, and that the arrangement she had made was never meant as a penalty. It was an opening. If Garrett had chosen differently, the house would have remained theirs. That choice had always been in his hands. Then she turned to me. She wrote that she had been watching me her whole life, or at least the portion of it that counted in what she had seen, was a man who poured everything he had into the people around him and required almost nothing in return. She wrote that this was at once his deepest strength and the very thing that had let people take from him without ever being made to reckon with it. She wrote that she carried no regret for the life they had made together, not for a single day. She wrote that the roses along the back fence needed cutting before winter. And then at the foot of the second page in handwriting that had steadied as though she had held something in reserve, saving it for this, she wrote the last of it. I have watched you hold this family together with your bare hands for 40 years, Len. I have watched you give and give again. I know you will find a way to forgive Garrett too in time, because that is the kind of man you are, and I would not change it. So I made sure the house would protect you, even when your heart couldn't. That is all I've done. The rest is yours. I love you. I have always loved you. Take care of the roses. I stayed in that chair a long while after I reached the end. The colored light from the south windows had shifted several inches across the stone floor. By the time I folded the letter back along its creases and returned it to the envelope, my hands were trembling slightly. I didn't try to stop them. I let them be. When I stepped out of the office, Father Dennis was waiting in the hallway with 2 cups of coffee. He passed one to me without a word of inquiry. I lowered myself into the chair beside him, and we sat there drinking in silence, 2 old men in an empty church on a quiet Thursday morning. It was enough. More than enough. Franklin had sent the new keys by courier in the week, following everything that happened. They came in a small, padded envelope with a typed note laying out which key belonged to which lock front door, side gate, back door, and the small padlock on the storage shed that I had put in myself back in 2006, using hardware I'd sourced from a supplier in Sun Valley, because I wanted the sort that would hold up for decades. 3 keys on a plain steel ring, no fob, no decoration, nothing extra, just the keys. I set the envelope on the kitchen counter and left it sitting there for 3 weeks. I drove out to Kensington Drive on a Tuesday morning in early October, when the light in Glendale takes on that particular quality. Autumn brings cooler than September, but still crisp the Verdugo Mountains visible from nearly every east-facing block, with the kind of sharp relief that only arrives after the season's first rains have scrubbed the air clean. I pulled into the driveway, my old spot, the one that had been mine before Garrett quietly claimed it as his own, and sat in the truck for a few minutes before making myself get out. The house looked the same from the street. That was the first thing that struck me. Whatever had gone on inside those walls over the past 3 years, the exterior gave nothing away. The porch railing I'd replaced in 2018 was still tight. The trim was still the warm white Elaine and I had settled on, together one Saturday afternoon, spreading a fan of paint samples across the kitchen table, a color she called honest, because she said it didn't pretend to be something it wasn't. The rose bushes out front had gone a bit wild, pushing through the fence slats toward the sidewalk, but that was nothing an hour with the pruning shears wouldn't put right. I got out and stood in the driveway. Howie DeLuca was at his fence inside of 45 seconds, which told me he'd been keeping an eye out for my truck. He didn't call over. He just raised one hand. I raised mine back. That was all either of us needed. He stayed at his fence while I walked up to the front door, present if I wanted him, invisible if I didn't. The new key turned clean and smooth. Cobb had done solid work. I pushed the door open and stood on the threshold for a moment before crossing inside. The house smelled different. Not wrong exactly, not unpleasant, just foreign other people's cleaning products, and the ghost of a candle that had been burned heavily in one spot, and beneath all of that, something I couldn't immediately place. Then I placed it new carpet. They'd replaced the floor in the living room. The original, the low-pile neutral, Elaine and I had chosen in 2003, the one she had picked, because she said it would still look decent in 20 years, and she had been right, was gone. In its place was something darker, charcoal gray, thicker and newer, and completely unknown to me. I stood there and looked at it. I want to say precisely what I felt, because it wasn't quite anger. It was something more tangled than that. Something without a tidy label. The feeling that comes from walking into a room that belongs to you and finding it rearranged by someone who saw no reason to ask, and who would not have understood why asking was the point. I moved through into the kitchen. The kitchen was largely as I remembered it, which caught me off guard. Same cabinets, same countertops. Elaine had fallen in love with during the 2010 remodel white tile threaded with a thin gray vein that she'd spotted at a showroom on San Fernando Road and couldn't let go of. Someone had added a small appliance caddy near the microwave and a magnetic knife strip on the wall that I hadn't put there, but beyond those two things, the room was still mine. I ran my hand along the counter edge the way I always had, checking the caulk line at the backsplash. Still solid. I had done that job myself, and I had done it properly. Down the hall, I passed Owen's old room, which Garrett and Renee had been using as a home office. The desk was gone, the equipment cleared out, the filing cabinet Renee had mentioned on that voicemail emptied and removed. The room held nothing now but the closet and the baseboards and the window looking out onto the side yard where the old Meyer lemon tree was still doing what it had always done, producing more fruit than two people could hope to use. Then I came to the door at the end of the hall, our bedroom, the room where Elaine and I had slept for 22 years, where she read in bed every night with the lamp burning on her side because she was incapable of falling asleep without first reading for a while, where she kept her jewelry box on the dresser beside the top drawer that stuck slightly, the one I had been meaning to sort out since 2015. The room where in the final weeks before we moved out to give Garrett and Renee more space, she had stood in the doorway for a long, quiet moment and looked at it before she reached in and turned off the light. I opened the door. The walls were gray, not the charcoal of the living room carpet, but a cooler shade, almost blue in the morning light, the kind of color that a decorating magazine would have had a name for, but that I would simply have called the color of an overcast sky. Every surface had been repainted. The trim I had cut in with a 2-inch brush over the course of one very long weekend in 2002, because Elaine wanted it done right, and I wanted to give her what she wanted now, the same cool gray as the walls. The room had been turned into something that could have belonged to any house on any street, stripped of memory, stripped of accumulation, stripped of the particular weight that a room builds up when people who love each other have lived inside it long enough. The dresser was gone. The lamp from Elaine's side was gone. The curtains she had sewn herself from fabric she'd tracked down at a shop on Central Avenue because nothing ready-made was quite right were gone, replaced by standard white blinds. I stood in the doorway for a long time. Then I crossed to the closet and opened it. Empty. Just the rod and the shelf above it and the faint rectangular shadow on the painted wall where a mirror had hung and been lifted away. I went downstairs to the storage area beneath the house. Elaine had always called it the dungeon, her name for any room that didn't let in enough natural light. It was a partial basement, really a large finished crawl space, something I had lined with plywood walls and a poured concrete floor sometime in the 90s. We kept seasonal things down there, and tools and the boxes that follow a family from one house to the next, without ever quite being unpacked, gradually becoming part of the furniture of a life by default, rather than by any deliberate decision. I found the mirror behind a stack of cardboard boxes near the water heater. It was wrapped loosely in a moving blanket, the rented kind that comes with a truck, which told me whoever had stowed it down there hadn't wanted it damaged, but hadn't given much thought to where it was actually going. I shifted the boxes aside and drew back the blanket. Elaine's mirror, the oval one in the dark wood frame that had hung in our bedroom for as long as I could remember. She had found it at an estate sale in La Cañada, Flint Ridge in the late 90s for $30 and carried it to the car herself because she didn't trust anyone else to hold it at the right angle. By any conventional measure, it was worth nothing. By every measure that mattered, it was irreplaceable because she had carried it herself, because it had been on our wall for 25 years, because every morning she had stood in front of it, and I had stood just behind her, and we had caught each other's eyes in the glass without either of us thinking about it. The way you notice things that have simply always been there. I carried it upstairs with both hands moving carefully, the way she would have wanted. I carried it into the bedroom and held it against the wall in the spot where it had always lived, at the height it had always hung. And I looked at what the glass gave back to me, an old man with a cheekbone still showing the last of a bruised gray at his temples, and the hands of someone who had spent his working life putting things together, standing in a room that needed attention in a house that carried his name. I held the mirror there for a long moment. Then I went out to the truck and brought in my toolbox. There was work to be done. My phone buzzed as I was coming back up the front path. "Owen? Ed, are you at the house?" "I am," I said. "How is it?" I looked up at the front of the place in the October morning light, the honest white paint, the porch railing I had put in, the roses nudging through the fence slats toward the sidewalk. "It needs some tending," I said, "but the bones are sound." A pause. "Caden keeps asking about you," Owen said. "He wants to know if he can come see the backyard. He says he remembers the tomatoes you used to grow back there." I hadn't grown tomatoes in that yard for 3 years. "Tell him the backyard needs about 3 more weeks," I said. "But after that I'd like him to come over. Tell him I have something to show him." "What are you going to show him?" I looked at the roses. "How to prune," I said. "I bought the groceries myself, not because anyone suggested it, because I wanted to. There is a difference, and I had spent the past month learning to pay close attention to that distinction in everything I did, the things I chose freely, the things I did out of habit, and the things I did because I was afraid of the alternative. This was a choice. I drove to the market on Verdugo Road early on a Saturday morning in the 3rd week of October. I bought chicken and corn, and the good rolls from the bakery counter, and 2 kinds of lemonade and a bag of ice. I loaded it all into the truck myself, and drove to Kensington Drive, and had the grill going before the first person arrived. The roses along the back fence were blooming again. I had put in 2 evenings the week before, cutting them back properly, clearing out the dead canes, opening up the center so light and air could get through. Howie DeLuca had leaned on the fence and supervised the whole operation, without being asked which was his particular style of helping, and I had taken it in the spirit he meant it. The roses had answered the way roses do when you give them honest attention. Fresh growth at the tips, color coming back into the blooms. Elaine would have been pleased. Father Dennis Pruitt arrived first, which didn't surprise me. Clergy tend to be punctual, as though treating time as a form of respect. He came through the side gate carrying a small ceramic dish covered in foil, told me he'd made it that morning, and when I lifted the corner of the foil, it turned out to be a peach cobbler, Elaine's favorite, the one he made every year for the church's fall social. I didn't say anything about that. I set it on the table and thanked him, and he gave a small nod, like that settled the matter. Howie came next over the fence rather than through the gate, because that was how Howie had always made his entrance, and there was no reason to alter it now. He brought tomatoes again, a full bag, this time placed them on the table, without any ceremony picked up the tongs, and took command of the grill without asking. That was also how Howie operated, and I accepted it without any argument either. Nadine Holloway arrived a few minutes after that. I had known Nadine for more than 20 years. She'd come to work in the accounting office of my contracting company in the early 2000s and had demonstrated within about 3 weeks that she understood running a small business considerably better than I did. She was 55 now, still sharp in exactly the way she'd always been, the kind of woman who noticed everything commented on, roughly a third of it, and kept the rest filed away until it became useful. She brought a bottle of sparkling water and 2 lemons and told me I looked better than she'd anticipated, which from Nadine was a real compliment. Aunt Beverly came with a covered dish of potato salad, pulled me into a hug that lasted longer than I expected, and then simply held on for a moment without saying a word. That was exactly the right thing to do, and she knew it. Then Owen arrived. He came through the gate with Caden up on his shoulders, the way he always carried him when Caden wanted to see over everything in the yard. Caden was 6 years old, wearing a shirt with a stegosaurus on it, and when Owen ducked under the gate frame and Caden had to grab the top beam to keep from taking a knock on the head, the boy laughed hard enough that he nearly lost his seat entirely. I crossed the yard to meet them. Owen set Caden down on the ground, and Caden looked straight up at me with the total unmediated directness that belongs to 6-year-olds. No warm-up, no approach, just the thing itself. "Grandpa," he said, "Uncle Owen said you're going to teach me how to cut the plants." The roses," I said. "Yes, after lunch we'll do that." He turned this over. "Do roses have thorns?" "They do." "Will I get poked?" Probably once or twice," I said. "That's how you figure out where they are." He weighed this with the gravity of someone absorbing a new law about how the world works, then gave a single nod indicating he found it acceptable and headed straight for the table to see what was on it. Owen watched him go, then looked at me. He'd had a particular expression on his face for the past month, half checking in, half something he hadn't landed on a word for yet. I laid my hand briefly on his shoulder. He nodded. That was enough. The afternoon moved the way good afternoons do, easy and unscripted, one thing drifting naturally into the next, with no one steering it. Howie held court at the grill. Father Dennis and Aunt Beverly found each other within minutes and settled into a corner of the yard for a conversation that seemed to be going well for both of them. Nadine sat with Owen and asked him about his students with the kind of genuine curiosity she'd always had for other people's work. Caden ate half a chicken leg, declared the rolls excellent, and then went to inspect the roses along the back fence with the methodical attention of someone who has been informed there are thorns and intends to locate each one before committing to anything further. I watched him crouch down at the base of the canes, both small hands floating just above the stems without quite touching them, and something moved in my chest that I didn't try to put a name to. After lunch, I took him to the roses in earnest. I showed him how to look for dead wood, how to trace a cane back from the tip until you found the swell of a bud, eye facing outward, how to make the cut on an angle so water would shed off instead of pooling and bringing rot. He listened with the complete focus children bring to anything practical, the same total attention he had given me once years ago, when he watched me stack wooden blocks on the living room floor of this house while he was barely old enough to sit up on his own. He got poked twice. Both times he examined his finger with interest, rather than complaint, the way a small scientist notes a result and moves on. Late in the afternoon, Howie was wrapping the leftover rolls in foil. Father Dennis was helping Aunt Beverly fold and stack the chairs, and Nadine and Owen were working through the last of the lemonade at the table. Caden drifted over and stood beside me at the edge of the porch. He looked up. "Grandpa." "Yes." "Why did Mommy say you were mean?" His voice carried no particular weight. It was just the question straightforwardly asked. "Because you're the nicest person I know." The yard went still the way a yard does when something honest has been said that nobody planned for. Owen turned his face toward the fence. Aunt Beverly set down the chair she was holding. Howie stood at the table with the foil in both hands and looked at the roses. I crouched down to Caden's level. "Sometimes," I said carefully, "people say things when they're hurting that don't line up with what's actually true. It doesn't make them bad people. It just means they were going through a hard time." Caden considered this. "Are you having a hard time?" "Not right now," I said. "Right now I'm doing pretty well." He looked at me for a moment with those clear 6-year-old eyes that haven't yet learned to see anything other than exactly what's in front of them. Then he put his arms around my neck and I held on to him, and the yard stayed quiet for a few seconds in the good way. The way that means everyone in it is exactly where they ought to be. Before the afternoon wound down, I told Owen I had spoken with Franklin that week. I told him I had signed the paperwork to update my will. The house would pass to Owen with a portion set aside for a building trades scholarship fund I had worked out with Franklin established in Elaine's name. Owen started to say something, and I told him there was no need to go into it further, and he accepted that the way he accepted most things when he heard the finality in my voice. The sun went behind the Verdugo Mountains at 5:37, and the backyard eased into the soft shadow that follows it. Everything still warm, but the hard edge of the light gone. The roses along the fence shifting from red to something richer and deeper in that changed air. Father Dennis found me on the porch as people were beginning to leave. "How are you, Leonard?" he asked. The real version of the question, the way Howie had asked it, the way people who genuinely know you ask it. I thought about everything the past month had held, the bruise that had faded out, the letter sitting in the drawer of my nightstand, the mirror back on its wall, the roses blooming again along the back fence, Caden's arms around my neck. "I think Elaine would say I'm right where she meant me to be," I said. Father Dennis smiled. Not the practiced warmth of someone performing his role, the real thing. "I think she would," he said. After everyone had gone, I sat alone on the back porch for a while. The yard held the quiet that settles in, after people you love have filled a space and left some of their warmth behind in it. The roses were dark shapes along the fence in the dimming light, the smell of the grill still hanging in the air. I had built a great many things across my life, houses and fences and porches that were still standing. A marriage that had lasted 41 years. A younger son who crossed town in the dark to make sure things came out right. A grandson who asked honest questions and learned where the thorns were without being the least bit afraid of them. I had not built any of it alone. Elaine had put her hands to half of everything I called mine, sometimes more than half. And she had done it in ways I was still only beginning to understand. I suspected I would go on finding them for the rest of my life. Small things she had set in motion and trusted time to bring to light. I could live with that. More than live with it, I was grateful. I spent 68 years believing that love meant turning up without being asked and giving, without keeping any kind of tally. I wasn't wrong about that. But I had been wrong about one thing. If you stayed with me all the way to the end of this one, thank you. Truly. This story asks something of you, and I know it. I have thought a long time about what this kind of experience costs a person. Leonard gave 40 years of himself quietly, without scorekeeping, without demanding recognition. And the hardest part was not what Garrett did at that barbecue. The hardest part was how long it had been allowed to build without anyone saying stop. I believe God places people in our lives: a son who films the truth, a lawyer who keeps the records, a wife who builds a floor under you before she goes. Because good men sometimes need help they would never think to ask for. The Lord's timing in the end has a way of being exact. Here is what this story left with me, and what I hope it leaves with you. When someone shows you who they are through their hands, believe it the first time. Do not apologize for what they did. If you are a father who has given everything and received very little back, know that your worth is not measured by how they treated you. Keep your records. Love generously, but document quietly. A wire transfer receipt and a filmed moment can speak for you when you no longer can. And if the people around you are carrying dad's revenge stories of their own, the slow, quiet, dignified kind, share this with them. These father stories matter. They remind us that a man does not have to raise his voice to reclaim what is his. He just has to stand still long enough for the truth to catch up. Leave me a comment below and tell me what stayed with you. Subscribe to His Hidden Revenge if you haven't yet. There are more stories here that deserve to be heard. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next one.